I'm a youth worker at heart. It's where my passion lies. It's what I've done for most of my life. I've run an open youth centre for 25 years in Birmingham, England. I don't do that anymore. Policy work and academic work have overtaken that. But for 40 years, I was a practitioner. For 30 years, I've been a researcher. Often, don't worry too much about the slides. I hate PowerPoint. I carry an article around called PowerPointless, which is usually that we all get it wrong, and I get it wrong as well. We put too many words on the screen, we forget to move it forward, and people think he's still talking about that, and the slides show that. Or I turn around and I read it all to you, and you can read it anyway, usually, and then I'm not engaging with you. So the slides are very broad kind of ideas, and if I plant 3 or 4 or 5 useful thoughts in your head in the next 30 minutes or so, then I will feel reasonably happy. And of course, learning is very much the agenda of this event, but learning for all of us is very much about being given ideas and challenges and trying to work them through. Somebody, a professor of education at Oxford University, Richard Pring, wrote a book very, very recently where he defined education as the initiation into the world of ideas. And sometimes, and I'll probably say it somewhere in this talk, when we do our youth work, surely one of the things we're doing is saying to young people, here are some different horizons for you to think about in your life. Somebody also once said that you cannot teach anybody anything, you can simply create environments in which they can learn. So one of the things we do as youth workers is to try to create learning contexts, not leisure contexts, and that is a tension in what we do. But youth work is a term that in most European countries is not understood at all. It's not even a word that is used. So, and when you talk about youth work, it's probably a different kind of youth work from that is used in my country. So, youth organisations in Europe will use youth work, meaning young people-led autonomous organisations. Youth work in my country tends to be about professionally trained youth workers running programs and projects, and sometimes clubs, for a younger age group of young people. And so from adult-led to youth-led, there's a whole spectrum of things in between that we all call youth work, but when we talk to each other from different places, we may not be sharing the same understanding. So one of the things that we have done in Europe, in the Council of Europe, 47 countries, is that we have, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've tried to capture the histories of youth work in different parts of Europe. Obviously, some of our European societies have had something called youth work, then a very imposed form of youth work, either under communism or under fascism. And then they've come out of that at certain points from 1945 to 1989 and regenerated a different form of youth work. And some countries, like my own, like Flemish Belgium, have 150 years of youth work development and evolution. So there's the history bit, already doing the PowerPointless thing. This is not to give you a lesson in British youth work history, it's simply to say that when we have discussions of youth work, one of the huge tensions that we talk about in the pub is between what governments want us to do and what we think we are doing, and people often say, we don't do old-fashioned youth work, we've got some modern version of it. But if you look historically at youth work, not just in Britain, but in many other countries, at different times it has been attached to different big political agendas. This British history points to the fact that after the Boer War in the 19th century, the big youth work agenda was producing fit kids for military service. Get them out in the countryside doing physical things. Get them in shape. Because something like 1 in 6 potential recruits to the British Army in 1890 were unfit for service. Wind the clock forward 50 years, and in the Second World War, youth work was supported by the state because there were concerns about crime and delinquency. Fathers going off to war, what did you do about teenage boys in the home? Somehow abandoned by parental fatherly discipline. Would this cause a crime wave? And so youth work was supported in order to provide some kind of regulation and discipline for some of these boys. And in the 1950s, when we had our biggest public investment in youth work, after something called the Albemarle Report, and Lady Albemarle is still alive, aged 97, a magnificent woman, amazing woman. She was a baroness, and she wrote a report in 1960. But at the heart of her report is saving Great Britain from rock and roll, from American cultural contamination, from Bill Haley and the Comets, from Rock Around the Clock, from James Dean and Marlon Brando and the Wild Ones. That's really what it was about. Give young people some healthy British experiences, and they won't embrace this horrible American music. Cultural rescue. And I could go on, but it's simply to illustrate the point that youth work has always been attached, pegged, hung to crime, health, citizenship, culture, in different ways at different times. This guy, Kenneth Thompson, came up with 5 A's. He did a review of British English youth services in 1981, and he came up with these 5 words. And basically, they're about young people mixing together, young people having something to do, young people having some space of their own, young people having somebody to talk to, and young people having somebody to represent them. And I think when you talk to most young people about what youth work means to them, it's usually that kind of package. I've always said that if you get rid of open youth work, which England is doing very well at the moment, its municipalities have almost scrapped all of their open youth work. 1 or 2 of you may know, and if you don't know, it's probably helpful professional information, that there is a new European network trying to defend and promote open youth work, which will be holding its very first European conference on January the 14th in Vienna, which I'm going to contribute to. Deep concerns that open youth work, places for associational gathering of young people to really do things that they want to do, is increasingly unsupported by political and economic structures. A further thing that I would like to say, and maybe this is a bit tough in a post-Soviet society such as your own, but everybody always talks about democratic youth work. I said, like hell was my youth centre democratic. If it had been democratic, it would have been tyrannised by the older boys, the 17, 18, 19-year-old boys. They would have come in and they'd have controlled all the equipment, they'd have controlled all the music, they'd have controlled everything, because they were the dominant group. I wanted to represent the minority of one. Then there's the issue about rules. We talk about youth participation and that young people can sort of determine how things should be. This is utter rubbish as far as I'm concerned in youth work. I am bound by the state laws. You know, young people, I want to smoke some cannabis, you can't. And then there are municipal rules that if I'm a professional paid worker, municipal rules may govern how long I'm allowed to drive a minibus. Might govern how long I'm allowed to work. And so when you're negotiating with young people, you have to tell them that these aren't my rules, they're somebody else's rules, and we are all bound by those rules. But, with a bit of luck, there's always plenty of space for young people to determine some of those rules. And that's the bit that is important in terms of negotiation and professionally then holding young people to account. Here are some rules that you can shape, that you can determine, but when they determine them and then you're taking them away for a weekend, I don't know what it would be. It might be what time they go to bed. Can we go to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning? Yeah, you can, but then I'm not driving anywhere because it won't be safe. Okay, we'll go to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning. And then it reaches 1 o'clock, and they say, well, we don't want to go to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning, we want to go to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning. What's your role there? I think your role is to say, look, this was discussed at length, this was agreed, I'm now holding you to that agreement. You can't just change the rules all the time. You had your opportunity. In my country, so many discussions, conversations with young people on the street. Well, we're really bored, we'd like to go away for the weekend. Okay, what are you going to do about it? They say, but we thought you would organise it for us. And I'd say, I'm not a tour operator, so I'm a youth worker. I said, there are things that you can do, there's things that I will do for you, but only if you do the things that you can do for yourselves. I wrote an article many years ago when I was thinking about this, running my youth centre. I wrote an article in 1983, that's quite a long time ago, but I said that we were so preoccupied with the acute anxieties of adolescence. For sure, 13 and 14-year-old kids have all kinds of traumas and anxieties in their lives, but usually they pass. And I said we were forgetting the emerging crisis of young adulthood. When you're 16 and 17 and 18 and you start to experience lengths of unemployment, you feel the world does not want you. Look at the suicide rates in Greece. When I was unemployed briefly in 1983, I walked to the unemployment office with 16 and 17-year-old young people, the ones in my youth club, because we were all unemployed, and we hung around and waited for the last one to come out from their interview, had they applied for enough jobs and all this stuff. And we walked 5 kilometres back to where we lived. And the only person who had any sense of purpose for the rest of that day was me. The other 20 kids, usually about 20, they sat on benches, smoked cigarettes, and talked about how could they kill the rest of the day. Tragic. And those are the young people that we have to try to engage with and pick up. But there will always be debates about what is the age target for youth work. Leave it too late, and it's hard to build the relationships. Do it too early, and then you don't actually deal with the real issues that youth, young people, face. And then, of course, linked to that, and this is the political debate across Europe, is the target question. Should youth work be open, universal? Should everybody be able to come and access it? Or should we, as youth workers, be going out there and finding the drug addicts or the at risk of offending or the at risk of dropping out of school types of young people? One or two of you may have been over the water on the ferry to Helsinki and looked at the way the Helsinki Youth Department has restructured its youth services, so it has open youth work still, and cultural youth work through the Happy Centre, the sort of music and gaming and all that sort of stuff. But it now has Luotsi, which is a targeted youth work at young people prematurely dropping out of school. You talk to some of those Luotsi workers and they talk about the difficulties and tensions. Having been open youth workers, now they are expected to go and work with a particular group of young people in a proactive way. Philip Cousset, the guy from Belgium, would talk very much about how youth work fits somewhere in the middle of something between the individual and between society. This is the whole social pedagogy debate. And there are great risks of youth work becoming too focused on the individual young person, or, as happened with, obviously, your pioneers in Komsomol in older times, instrumentalized by the state. So youth work simply became a delivery agent for the state. The last words on that slide, personal and social development, are now the English words that define what youth work is. About a year ago, the English government put together a document called Positive for Youth, and they used this term personal and social development 16 times in that document, and it's all about, youth work is about personal decision making and social relationships. It's about equipping with young people with the knowledge and understanding to make sensible personal decisions, and with the group experiences that equip them for positive and productive social relationships. And the sort of Western European, British, Flemish model is very much based on some of these sacred ideas about youth work is young person focused. It's holistic. It's not breaking those kids up into school failures and criminals. It's about the individual. The final thing here is the question, I don't know what you do here, but in the Netherlands, for example, street-based youth workers are required, beyond child protection and safeguarding regulations, to reveal information about young people which might be of relevance to policing or schooling and other things. Next door, in Flanders, street-based youth workers have a condition of professional secrecy. They are not allowed to reveal information to other agencies. And this whole question of information sharing is hugely difficult. We don't want to go talking to everybody. Young people build a relationship of trust with us. On the other hand, then we start seeing police interventions or educational interventions with those young people, and we sort of think they're not getting it right. And often it's because they don't know the story. So what's our responsibility to help some other professional colleagues understand the story of that young person better? There was a huge youth work study in England conducted by a man called Bernard Davis and some others, but Bernard is a guru of youth work, and their publication, their research and analysis suggested that youth work can help to produce positional change in our dialogue, in our activities with young people. We can get those young people who are unemployed, who may be drug users, who may be at risk of early pregnancy, who may be, all these other risk things. We may be able to get them to think differently about how they want their lives to unfold. That's personal change. And personal change is essential if you are then to have any chance of positional change, which is getting a job, using contraceptives, and those other things. But if we tell people in power and with money that youth work produces jobs, or youth work prevents unwanted pregnancy, or youth work stops young people taking drugs, then we will be tested on that claim and we are almost certainly bound to fail. So, one is I get very worried about people who talk about youth work in terms of a discrete project, a kind of moment in time. Most of my youth work, and I'm drawing on experience here, was based on a kind of journey. A group of kids rock up at my youth centre age 13. I get to know them. Certain issues emerge. We decide to try to deal with some of those issues through maybe a residential experience away from the neighbourhood. Maybe I deal with those issues on an individual basis through a kind of low-level counselling or information-giving process. The group isn't fixed. Some friends move away, other friends join the group. So the group in itself is fluid. The contexts I'm working with them in are different. Sometimes it's a fairly structured weekend away, sometimes it's hanging around in the youth club, sometimes it's me bumping into them on the street. So methods, groups, issues and contexts vary over time, and we have this kind of journey, and eventually the youth work journey comes to a halt because those kids leave home, go to university, stop coming to the youth centre, or whatever it may be. And I think it's important to always tell that story of the fluidity of youth work. It's not a kind of like formal education is, you've got a group of kids in September, and they all leave a year later, and you can somehow measure a group there and measure a group there, because it's not like that at all in non-formal education. It's a triangle of three things. Youth policy, which has expectations about what we need to do in a country for our young people. Youth work and its principles and philosophy about why we are different from schools or careers or counselling or child protection or other things. And young people that we bump into who say, this is what we want from you. And I've seen youth workers sucked into all three of those corners, and they become useless, hopeless youth workers. Some become instruments of the state. I've got loads of money to do this youth unemployment project, but they stop doing youth work. Yeah, youth workers with such precious attachment to their principles of anti-oppressive practice and that sort of thing, that they get out on the street, and how do they deal with racist young people? And I've been in countries where youth workers say, I don't want anything to do with racist young people. If I meet a bunch of skinheads who are hostile to immigration and blacks, I don't want to talk to them. I say, so you deny them a youth work offer, do you? That's strange, because surely they need it more than most. And then there's the group of youth workers who think that the job of the youth worker is to be really popular with young people by responding to their wants. I want to do this, so you respond to that. None of those things are youth work anymore. The youth worker has to manage those three pressures within that track. Philip and I wrote an article quite recently in Childhood Australia where we talked about youth work being possibly the hardest job in the world, trying to balance so many things. Young people don't come to youth work to be educated, even non-formally educated. They come to hang around with their mates. They come to have fun. They come to, have a good time in their leisure. So we're hypocritical because we want to give them some non-formal learning and education, but they want to have some fun. How do you bring that together? A couple of years ago, Arno mumbled something in a workshop in Ghent, in Belgium. He said, I think youth work is a bit like a dog, looking for a home, somebody to feed it. It's kind of lost and lonely. I started to think about youth work as a dog. And I thought Ardo actually had quite an interesting idea about a dog that's gone astray, or is a stray dog, searching around. What kind of dog is it? What kind of dog do young people want? What kind of dog does society want? And if youth work is a dog, then young people want a protector, a companion, a guide. But societies increasingly want a kind of retriever. Go out and find the difficult kids, sort them out and bring them back in. And we find that youth work in some countries is increasingly funded not by ministries of education, but by ministries of justice, or by ministries of health. Because what they want are youth workers who go and support the health agenda, or youth work that supports the criminal justice agenda. When we talk about youth work, we always talk about relationships, trust, credibility, and you only get those things if you have time and patience. Politicians and funders must learn the art of patience. That if you really are to work with more challenging and difficult and troubled and troublesome young people, it will not happen overnight. And that and yet politicians always want an answer tomorrow. Or in fact, yesterday, they usually want the answer. Politicians are preoccupied, and funders are preoccupied with the stuff on the other side of these scales. Targets, who are you reaching? Measurement, outcomes, impact, in order to make a cost-benefit judgment about the value of our work. And I am not standing here to say that that is unimportant, but I'm saying that if those targets and all those sorts of things starts to outweigh those other things, relationships, time, patience, trust, then we will no longer be doing youth work. And in my country, we find more and more NGOs, which are desperate for public money, are making claims that they can turn the lives of young people around faster and faster for more and more young people, cheaper and cheaper. And I know damn well that the way they can justify that claim is because they cherry-pick the easy kids from a population that the government says are important to target, the ones at risk of X, Y, or Z. They target the easiest of those groups. Somebody, Graham Tiffany, who is a global street-based youth work protagonist, advocate. Graham calls this the Pistachio Effect. We all know what it's like to eat pistachio nuts. You know, you eat 2 or 3 and they're lovely, and you get another and you can't flip and open it. So you tuck it round the back in the pile, and you pick another one, and then finally somebody comes along and says, I fancy a pistachio nut, and they're all the ones you can't open. And in a way, he uses that as a youth work analogy for if you really want to crack open the young people who are most at the margins with the biggest cluster of challenges and difficulties in their own lives and causing them for our societies as well, then youth workers have to be given space to really work at that. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I'm nearly finished. For the last 10 years, I have written a weekly column in a British youth work magazine, 500-word stories. And the very first of those, published in January 2003, was about a horrible kid called Dean. Dean was a heroin user when he was 12. Dean spent his early teenage years in prison most of the time, 5 prison sentences before he was 17. Dean did write me a short story of his life, a 5-page, very powerful and poignant note from prison, which his girlfriend was completely pissed off about because she said to me, he only ever writes me half a page, and he's written you 5 pages. But I described Dean as a kid who hated the world. He hated every professional he ever met. And he hated me as well. But he hated me slightly less than he hated teachers and policemen and other drugs counsellors and so on. And I stayed with him. He was an obnoxious young man, unpleasant, the very sort of person that we really don't want to spend any of our lives with. But I was always said, Dean, when you're ready, we'll have a chat. Took 6 years to have that chat. He came out of custody when he was 17 3/4, and I went with his girlfriend to the prison gates, and we met him, and he got in my car, and we took him home. And we tried before, and every time he was back on the drugs and back in custody within a week, and back in prison within a month. But on that occasion, he said, I don't want to go back there because he was facing the adult prison system. And so we worked out a sort of way of trying to provide A, positive support, and B, some kind of shield against the negative stuff that he was easily sucked back into. And that time he responded to me. And we're still in touch, and he's 27 now, and he's an interior designer. And he's still with Jenna, his girlfriend, and things are quite good in his life. But it could have worked out very differently. And he did say to me once, he said, you were the only one who stayed with me. This very simple picture, Philip Cussé used this term in Flemish at a conference on street-based youth work in Antwerp. And Philip said, you don't grow grass by pulling it. It's not an English expression, it's a Flemish expression. But it is important that we talk about being gardeners, cultivators of young people. We plant seeds. We're not mechanics to sort them out, to fix their problems. We have to plant seeds so that they can fix problems themselves. And returning to the theme of this event, in Roman times, Plutarch said that education is not the filling of a vessel, but the lighting of a flame. So, tanan, my only Estonian word.